Welcome to the Generative Edge, the podcast that keeps you up to date with the latest news and events in the world of generative AI. I'm Stephanie, and I'm a consultant at Deloitte Central Europe.
I'm Brandon, and I'm the Natural Language Processing and Generative AI Practice Lead for Deloitte Central Europe.
And we are back with another GenAI in the news episode for you guys.
Love it.
It's been a while since we've done one of these, so lots has happened in the world of generative AI.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to just dig into it and see what the big top stories have been.
Let's do it.
So, Brandon, you sent me this really interesting, nerdy report about the Anthropic Economic Index is the title. So I was reading through it, and it seems like this report is really informative, first of all, but it's explaining the usage, what folks are actually using generative AI large language models for, which is something that we've hypothesized quite a bit on this podcast, but it seems like now we have the data to back it up, which is really cool. So maybe just really high level, tell us a little bit about this report. What were some of the interesting findings that you noticed? Because I noticed maybe first and foremost the tasks that actual people are using generative AI for versus enterprises or businesses. So I would love to dig into that a little bit.
Sure. So for those of you who don't know what Anthropic is, it's just another company that has large language models and chatbots and APIs available for developers.
All kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah. So it's essentially like another kind of OpenAI, if you're familiar. And what they did was basically collect millions of conversations and anonymized them so that personal data was taken out. And they used that data for analysis. And what they wanted to look at was what type of work generative AI was being used for and how often and by whom, in which occupations, and then just did some analysis on that. They also open sourced the data set, so actually anybody can download that data now.
Oh, that's cool.
Millions of conversations, which is kind of cool. I mean, it sounds a little bit, makes
Scary.
me a little bit nervous, yeah. But they say that it's anonymized. I assume that that's the case. So we can dig into some of the numbers. Largely, it follows kind of what we expected it to. There's really a lot of LLM usage for computer programmers, for software developers. More than a third of all conversations or usage of the large language models have to do with basically developing code or maintaining websites, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And another probably big finding was that around there's a 60-40 split. So 57% of people are using it for augmentation of their current work tasks. So writing emails, restructuring news data, that kind of thing. And around 40% of them are using it for automation. So that's strictly using the API in some kind of software, and it's automating some kind of process end to end without any human intervention. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's a little surprising but not shocking, right? So the fact that it's so 60-40, right? So the way I'm reading this is that 57% of people, let's be accurate. This report says that regular people are using these models, the software, to help them in their daily work lives.
Yes.
Which is, again, this is something we've talked about on the podcast, that we want people to experiment. We want people to really get their hands dirty and familiarize themselves with this technology. So it's really, I guess, exciting to hear that there's that many people from this data set, they're actually doing that. So that's hopeful news, I would say.
And they, the other hopeful part, I guess, is that during their analysis, they came up with a conclusion that, okay, we shouldn't be talking about automating occupations, but rather automating occupational tasks.
Yes. Okay.
So they've broken it, which is something that we've actually talked about before. It's not going to automate an entire job or an entire person, but it is going to automate specific tasks. And it does seem like people are catching on to that they're using it for specific types of tasks, doing research, recording or analyzing report data, providing customer support. What else do we have here? Something like chemical analysis, experiments on substance.
Technical writing, these kinds of things.
That kind of stuff, for sure.
Which, I mean, I'm not going to say that some folks don't love to do those types of tasks, but they do seem to be the tasks that are quite labor intensive, but have to get done. So maybe not a ton of joy. Again, I don't want to take anyone's joy from them. I know I'm not the greatest fan of technical writing and things. But I know it's important. It needs to get done. So it's interesting to see that those types of tasks are the ones that people are naturally gravitating towards.
It can sometimes also be problematic because actually this was in a report that you sent me a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you remember, but there were a lot of there's basically 17% of all peer review is now written by a large language model.
Oh, yes, I remember this.
So in academia, this is a place where it's really gray area whether we should be using large language models to aid in research or to do research or to write research papers. Because I can tell you just what the state of research right now in generative AI and machine learning is just completely flooded by pre-release papers that are not peer-reviewed.
Okay.
And a lot of those non-peer-reviewed papers will go to publication like on the news, or they'll generate a lot of hype, or they may even pass peer review, but that peer review was supported by somebody who either didn't read the paper or didn't understand it well enough and generated a summary or something with a large language model. This isn't unique to this field of science. By and large, the peer review process works. There's not a whole lot of there aren't really junk papers entering really big journals with a lot of let's say trustworthiness. But it is the case that if you just look up research and you don't know what you're looking for and you don't know which journals are trustworthy, that a lot of the first papers that come up are just the ones that are generated. And it's hard to tell the difference now. So
I remember us talking many podcast episodes ago about the human ability to differentiate between something that is generative AI created versus not.
Yeah.
And this seems to be that intersection of are we actually reading the report? Are we just reading a summary of a summary of a summary of a report? And especially, as you said, in academia, in these research arenas, this is the moment where you actually do read the report.
Yes,
you actually do
do you
check everything.
Do you know Cliff Notes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I used Cliff Notes quite a bit when I was in school, yes.
Maybe this is just a strictly American thing, but if you grow up in the American education system, you have to read some books, you do book reports, and it's very popular for some of the students who maybe don't want to read the book that they'll read the Cliff Notes, which is basically a condensed version of it. So I kind of view it like that. You know, if you're supposed to read and understand some material so that you can use it later, using generative AI is kind of like reading the Cliff Notes. If you're just generating a summary or bullet points, you get the gist, but you don't really understand the paper. And that's, I think, on all of us to be responsible. If you need to know something, really read it. Don't just expect large language models to give you all the answers. So.
I was going to say, just to, put my credibility back on the line. I did read quite a few books when I was in school, but I definitely used Cliff Notes to help me figure out some of the themes that maybe I wasn't picking up on, which again is maybe a better use case for generative AI,
also,
right?
Yes.
That's something where you still read the book, you still read the report, you did your due diligence, but you need help discerning the information or the themes.
Distilling it,
then it makes sense to use it. But it's interesting that this report is picking up on some of that.
Yeah, for sure.
So let me just ask you about the more enterprise side of things. So we said automation is the 40% the 43% to be accurate. Did they say what types of tasks they were focused on in that arena?
So let's see, about 10% of them were in arts and media. So this is technical writers, copywriters, and editors. We have around, again, 10% in education. So tutors, archivists, instructional designers. They're doing something designing comprehensive educational curricula, teaching materials, disseminating research in the life, physical, and social sciences.
That's interesting.
And then only 8% in office and administrative, which kind of surprised me.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Maybe the workforce is smaller. I'm not really sure. But it's mostly bioinformatics technicians. That was kind of surprising.
Yeah.
Statistical assistants, IT system administration and maintenance. It's kind of all over the place.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me, and I think we've referenced this chart or report before, but we have this beautiful infographic that we use at Deloitte that has a heat map kind of vibe about all the industries that could potentially be transformed by generative AI. It seems to me that these findings kind of match up with those assumptions as well, that the high-tech fields, like you said, the education, things where there's a lot of content and copywriting, those are the enterprise arenas that are being impacted the most, according to this
Yes.
study as well.
Kudos to the people who came up with that chart,
Yeah.
months and months and months ago that we were talking about. Was it McKinsey?
Alright, yeah, somebody, I forget who.
Somebody made this report, and it showed like how much value we expected to generate from like different use cases. This largely does go along with that. So we see a lot of the value coming from computer and math and from like programming, software design, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I definitely want to talk about the elephant in the room, let's say. There were some pretty big generative AI waves being made recently about DeepSeek.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
So I feel like we should probably talk about it.
Sure. What would you like to know?
Let's start really high level.
Yeah.
What is DeepSeek? Because it's been in the news. It's got a cute little whale logo, but like, what is DeepSeek actually?
Yeah, so DeepSeek is just another large language model, but it is trained in a slightly different way than we're used to seeing with models like OpenAI or with Claude, as far as we know, their training methods. So it's heavily focused on reinforcement learning, which basically means like coming up with a reward model so that the model can sort of like distinguish between good and bad answers by itself, and it uses a lot of synthetic data to like reinforce those behaviors.
Okay.
And what happens is that basically they reported that training the model only cost something like $5 million. Well, I say only.
Yeah, I was going to say that seems low compared to the other
Compared
companies.
with the other ones, it's really low. And the inference cost is also much lower. So just running DeepSeek, I think it's like 6 times cheaper than GPT-4o.
Oh, wow.
For input and output mixed. And it achieves similar levels of performance. So right now on the LMSys leaderboard, which is basically like a grassroots initiative to keep track of all the language models that are commercially available or open source, and then rank them based on how much people like them, it's second after GPT-4.
Wow.
So it's way up there. From a technical perspective, this is really cool because it's less resource intensive. It's much cheaper to train the model, and we can achieve like a similar level of performance across different tasks with less money and less compute, which is good.
Yeah.
There are some concerns about where it came from and what it's doing, so which we can get into in just a second, I guess. But there is a concern, the major concern for at least people in the technical field is that the benchmarking data, so, whenever a large language model comes out, it runs through these benchmark data sets and tries to generate answers to different questions, that kind of thing, and then we measure its performance. It looks like a lot of the benchmarking data was actually used in the training data for this model. So it's kind of like having a test, but you've already trained on the test.
Okay. Like having the answer key kind of?
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of had the answer key while it was training. So the first day that it came out, everybody was freaking out because it like surpassed all these benchmarks. But then we found out later, okay, it was probably trained on data that came out of GPT. It was probably trained on publicly available information that includes the data sets for those benchmarks.
Okay.
So it may not be like technically as good as we think it is, but people still seem to like it.
Yeah.
And the answers that it generates are generally fine.
Yeah. Now, if I heard correctly, I believe it's also open source, right? So that means anyone can access. Like, what are they accessing at that point?
Yeah, so a model is basically just a binary file, right? It's just like an input-output thing. You put some data in, it calculates what the next word is going to be a bunch of times, and then it spits it out. So that hasn't changed in the last couple of years. Exactly the same as GPT, exactly the same as every other large language model. You can download it. You can download different sizes of it. So like different billions of parameters or whatever. And some of them are better for certain use cases. The really big ones take a lot of like a big machine to run, but they're the best performance. But then you have the actual product itself. So you could log in, for example, you could maybe download one of the older GPT models, GPT-2 or something, and use it on your computer. But when you log into OpenAI.com or something, or to, AWS's large language models, or,
just any of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Or if you log into AWS's Bedrock, and try to use one of those large language models, you're actually interacting with the server and with that company. In this case, people were freaking out because they were writing things into DeepSeek's web app. Not downloading the model and then freaking out about that, but there seemed to be censorship using the tool on the website, which makes sense because it's, it needs to comply with the laws of the country where it came from, which in this case is China.
Yeah.
And because of that, if you use the web app, it's going to sort of censor some of the outputs depending on whether it aligns with their terms of use.
Okay.
Whereas with the like OpenAI models, generally they take a different approach, which is censorship during training, and then generate the response and just like basically have like a usage policy saying like don't use it for anything harmful, blah blah blah.
Okay. So that's kind of where maybe some of the more sensational headlines were coming from is the fact that it's doing this censorship, quote unquote, after the fact versus before the fact, which is, again, just like you said, terms of use, it's complying with the laws of where it's being hosted.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is interesting, though, because I feel like, and again, our purpose on this podcast is to break through the hype and figure out what is actually happening there. So it seems to me that maybe because of where it's being hosted, because of the laws that it's following, you said it's, the most popular or second most popular LLM out there, at least for now. Do you see a lot of enterprise possibility with this LLM because of the controversial points of it? Or do you think it's something that folks will stray away from in the business world?
I think it's actually going to be used in a lot of enterprises. Okay. So because the model is open source, because they released the technical paper about how they trained it, when you're working in like automation, for example, you're probably not going to be talking about politics. You're probably not going to be talking about ideology or whatever else. You're like basically trying to automate certain processes that are more or less technical. In 60% of the cases, these people, anybody are using the large language models for augmenting their current work. Maybe it deals with those topics, but by and large, at least from what I can see on this, on this task list, none of them seem to be particularly political in nature. So I don't think that it's really something to be super concerned about. Okay. I mean, in the news, we already see reports of people using the open source models in their products, like Andrew in deeplearning.ai. He's using it. So, I don't see anybody particularly shying away from it, but I do see a lot of people like trying to get in on the hype. I see them getting in on the hype, and I see them getting in on the sensationalization of the news around DeepSeek, basically for clout. In my opinion, it's just my opinion.
We've never experienced that in generative AI before. Yeah. Come on. But I think it's an interesting point because, again, we're breaking through the hype, as I mentioned. So the fact that there are business applications or use cases that make sense to use this particular LLM, like it makes sense to me that people would be open-minded because if it's doing something cheaper, which is the first point, and if it's performing the same way or similar to what's available, like obviously price point comes into play because it's a business, right? But if it makes things more accessible to folks or there's more options available so people can test things out, all in all, I feel like that's a positive.
I think so. Kind of where I see this going is that, we've been talking about the technical implementation details. We've been talking about how these models work and what people are using them for. And increasingly in the news, it's starting to look like, the AI race. We have different countries rather than companies. These like in the news, it'll say, oh, the United States has done this. And so it's starting to become this weird sort of philosophical debate about like, what is the responsibility of us as a society together as a country to invest in AI? Do we need to race against other countries? Does it represent a risk? And I would say that there's probably not very many specialists in AI who work in government, and I don't know how they're going to handle those questions and whether they will be in our best interest, but let's see.
Well, you know where to find us if you need help with that. So I think that's a interesting note to end on. If you all listeners out there have any interesting news stories that you think we should know about, that we should discuss on the pod, of course, you can send them our way. We always appreciate audience participation as well. So thank you, Brandon, so much for breaking down the news for us.
Sure. Thanks, Steph. And remember, generate responsibly.
Thank you for listening to The Generative Edge, a Deloitte Central Europe and AWS production. Your hosts are Brandon Eychaner, Vyasaraj Kulkarni, and Donovan Spronk. Our show is executive produced by Stephanie Cohen, Vanch Luthra, Ian Masters, and the Deloitte studio in Prague. Head writers are Stephanie Cohen and Brandon Eychaner. Our sound and audio engineer is Wojtek Krasa, who also serves as our editor and videographer. Michal Trusina is our graphic designer. Our marketing and social media managed by Stephanie Cohen and the Deloitte studio in Prague. And our theme song was written and produced by Jakub Vlašek. Don't forget to rate and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.